Verstappen just said something after China that could change everything. Not about Red Bull, not about his DNF, about Mercedes. Because while his car was losing power, struggling, becoming unpredictable, Mercedes looked unstoppable. Too stable, too consistent, too perfect. And that's exactly what raised alarms. Because Verstappen described these new cars as heavy, unpredictable, almost impossible to trust. He said every lap feels like survival. So here's the question that has the FIA paying attention. If every driver is fighting the car, why aren't Mercedes? How are Antonelli and Russell pushing flat out, lap after lap, without hitting the limits everyone else is struggling with? Because in this new era, energy is restricted. Deployment is limited. Performance should drop. But in China, it didn't. Not for Mercedes. And now, the FIA is looking closer. Because if one team has found a way to control what others can't, this isn't just an advantage. It's a potential game changer. So the real question is not what Verstappen said. The real question is, what did he reveal, without actually saying it? What makes Verstappen's words so powerful is not what he said directly. It's what his experience revealed. Because everything he described in China points in the opposite direction of what Mercedes showed on track. Think about it. He talks about instability, about unpredictability, about cars that feel heavy, disconnected, difficult to trust. He describes a system where every lap is a fight, where you're constantly managing limits, managing energy, managing behavior. And then you look at Mercedes, and you see none of that. No corrections mid-corner, no hesitation on throttle, no visible signs of the driver adapting to the car. Instead, the car adapts to them. Smooth, precise, consistent. And that contrast is where the real story begins. Because in Formula One, when two realities exist at the same time, someone is doing something fundamentally different. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Because Verstappen didn't just struggle. He failed. A complete loss of power. Right at the moment where energy demand is highest. Late in the race. Under load. Exactly when the system is most stressed. And that kind of failure is not random. It's what happens when systems are operating near their limits. Now compare that to Mercedes. Same race. Same conditions. Same regulations. And yet, no drop. No failure. No visible stress on the system. They didn't just survive the limits. They never seemed to reach them. And that's what the FIA is now trying to understand. Because if one team can operate without hitting those limits, there are only two explanations. Either they are managing the system better than anyone else, or they are operating in a completely different window. Now let's go deeper. Because this is not just about reliability. It's about how performance is sustained. In this generation of cars, energy deployment is everything. You cannot push flat out forever. At some point, the system pulls you back. That's built into the rules. That's what creates balance. But in China, Mercedes looked like they could ignore that. Lap after lap, the same output, the same speed, the same control. And that kind of consistency is what makes engineers nervous. Because consistency like that usually comes from deep system control. Not just good driving. Not just good setup. Something deeper. Now connect this to Verstappen again. Because his frustration is not just about Red Bull. It's about the nature of these cars. He's describing a reality where the driver has to compensate constantly. Where the machine is not fully under control. And if that's true, then Mercedes achieving the opposite becomes a question, not an assumption. A question. Now add one more layer. Timing. This is only the second race of the season. Which means, most teams are still discovering the limits. Still pushing. Still learning. But Mercedes already looks like they've mastered it. And that's unusual. Because mastering a system this complex, this early, usually means one of two things. You understood something before everyone else. Or you found something others haven't even seen yet. And that's exactly why this situation is escalating. Because the FIA doesn't wait for proof. They react to patterns, to anomalies, to differences that don't align with expectations. And right now, Mercedes is that difference. Now imagine what happens next. Every team starts comparing data. Looking at how Mercedes deploys energy. How long they sustain it. Where they gain time. And if they can't replicate it, they don't accept it. They challenge it. That's how Formula One works. So this is no longer just about Verstappen's frustration. It's about what his experience revealed. A gap. A contradiction. A situation where one team is living a completely different reality from the rest. And when that happens, the sport always reacts. So the real question is no longer what Verstappen said. It's what his words exposed. Because if Mercedes has found a way to control what others can't, then they are not just faster. They are operating on a different level. And that's exactly the kind of advantage that never stays unquestioned for long. But here's where everything starts to connect, in a way that changes the entire picture. Because what Verstappen experienced, and what Mercedes demonstrated, are not just different outcomes. They are opposite realities. One driver fighting instability, another team showing absolute control. And in Formula One, that kind of gap doesn't exist by accident. Now let's go one step deeper. Because this is not just about how fast the car is. It's about how predictable it is. And predictability is everything in this era. These new cars rely heavily on electrical systems, energy recovery, deployment timing, software control, and all of that has to work perfectly every single lap. If it doesn't, the driver feels it immediately. Small inconsistencies, delayed responses, unstable balance. Exactly what Verstappen described. But Mercedes showed none of that. And that's where the real question appears. How do you turn a system that is naturally inconsistent into something that behaves perfectly? Because that doesn't come from driving. That comes from control. Deep control. Now here's the part that makes engineers uncomfortable. Because achieving that level of control usually means one thing. You understand the system at a level others don't. Or, you are using it in a way others are not. And that difference is where investigations begin. Now think about the W17. It's not just fast in a straight line. It's not just stable in corners. It's consistent everywhere. Entry, mid-corner, exit, long straights, short bursts, no visible weak point. And that suggests something very specific. Integration. Perfect integration between the engine, the electrical systems, and the chassis. Everything working together as one. But here's the risk. The more integrated a system becomes, the harder it is to separate what is allowed from what is pushing the limits. Because performance doesn't come from one part. It comes from how everything interacts. And that's much harder to regulate. Now connect this to the FIA. Because this is exactly what they are trying to understand. Not just what Mercedes is doing, but how they are doing it. How the energy flows through the system. How long it can sustain maximum output. Why it doesn't show the same limitations as others. And if that behavior sits too close to the edge, they act. Now add another layer. Pressure from the grid. Because other teams are not just watching. They are questioning. If they cannot replicate what Mercedes is doing, they will challenge it. They will push the FIA to define it. And once that happens, the investigation becomes more than technical. It becomes political. Now imagine what that means for Mercedes. They are not just defending performance. They are defending an interpretation. A concept. A way of extracting speed from the regulations. And that is much harder to protect. Because interpretations can change. Quickly. Quietly. And when they do, the advantage disappears. Now bring Verstappen back one last time. Because his words are now part of this story. Not as evidence, but as context. He described a system that is difficult to control. A car that forces the driver to adapt constantly. And by doing that, he highlighted just how unusual Mercedes really is. Because if that is the reality for most, then Mercedes is operating outside that reality. Not necessarily illegally, but differently. And in Formula One, different is never ignored. So now everything leads to one final moment. The next race. Because that's where the truth starts to show. If Mercedes comes back and looks exactly the same, then they have solved something fundamental. Something the rest haven't. But if something changes, if the consistency drops, if the car starts to behave more like the others, then we will know that what we saw in China was not just dominance. It was a window, a glimpse, of something that the sport itself is now trying to understand, and possibly trying to control. And if all of this still feels like a theory, like something that might fade away with time, there is one final detail that makes this impossible to ignore. Because Formula One doesn't allow mysteries to last. Not when championships are at stake. Not when one team suddenly operates on a different level. And not when the gap appears this early in a new era. Because what happened in China was not subtle. It was visible, clear, undeniable. Mercedes didn't just beat the field. They controlled the race in a way that removed uncertainty. And that's what the sport reacts to. Not just speed. Control. Now think about what always happens next. The FIA gathers more data. More comparisons. More analysis across multiple races. They don't rush. They observe. They wait for patterns to repeat. Because one race raises questions. 2 races start to give answers. And that's exactly where we are heading. Now imagine the next Grand Prix. Same cars, same regulations, but a completely different environment. More scrutiny, more pressure, more attention on one team, Mercedes. Because now, every sector matters more. Every straight tells a story. Every lap becomes evidence. And that's when the smallest change becomes visible. If the energy drops earlier, people will see it. If the consistency breaks, people will notice. If the gap shrinks, people will connect it. Nothing will go unnoticed. Now here's the critical moment. Because this is where dominance is tested. Not when everything is perfect, but when everything is being questioned. Because it's easy to be fast when no one is looking. It's much harder when everyone is. Now add the final layer. Time. Because this situation cannot stay in the middle. It will go one of 2 ways. Either Mercedes continues exactly as they did in China and proves they are simply ahead, or something changes. Small at first, almost invisible, but enough to alter the balance. And when that happens, the narrative shifts instantly. From dominance to limitation. From advantage to adjustment. And that's when the real story reveals itself. So now everything leads to one unavoidable conclusion. China was not the answer. It was the question. A question that the entire sport is now trying to solve. Through data, through pressure, through scrutiny, and most importantly, through what happens next. Because in Formula 1, the truth is never hidden for long. It shows itself on track, in performance, in consistency, in results. So the next race is not just another chapter. It's the moment where we begin to understand if Mercedes has truly mastered this new era, or if what we saw in China was something the sport itself was never going to let continue.